A man was lying in the dark on the floor of a stone prison, somewhere on the cold coast of the Black Sea. His eyes had been gouged out 3 days earlier. His captors had forced a strange potion down his throat, a drug brewed from herbs and human blood, designed to destroy his mind. Outside the prison walls, he could hear the voices of the people who would eat him. Not metaphorically, literally. They were sharpening their knives. The man's name was Matthias, and just months earlier, he had been one of the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ, chosen in a locked upper room in Jerusalem to replace the most infamous traitor in human history. How does a man go from sitting at the right hand of Peter to being blinded and held in a cannibal's pantry on the edge of the world? Why did the early church fathers spend so much energy preserving stories about him, even as the New Testament itself stayed almost completely silent? Why was a gospel written in his name only to vanish from history after the church declared it forbidden? And why, 2,000 years later, do his bones still rest beneath a German cathedral, while his existence remains one of the most carefully buried mysteries in Christianity? Ask any churchgoer to name the apostle who replaced Judas, and you will get blank stares. He is the forgotten one, the 13th apostle who was always meant to be the 12th, the man whose gospel was erased. This is the story of Matthias, the apostle the church remembered just enough to bury. And what really happened to him will change how you read the entire book of Acts. To understand how Matthias ended up in that prison, we have to go back to the moment everything started. About 40 days after the crucifixion of Jesus, 11 frightened men were hiding in an upper room in Jerusalem. They had once been 12. One of them had hanged himself in a field outside the city, his body broken on the rocks below, his name now a curse on every faithful tongue. Judas Iscariot was gone, and the brotherhood Jesus had built with his own hands was incomplete. Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, the man who had denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed, stood up. He opened the scriptures and read from Psalm 109, "Let his days be few, and let another take his office." To every Jew in that room, this was not a metaphor. The number 12 was sacred. 12 tribes, 12 gates of the holy city. Jesus had not chosen 11 apostles. He had chosen 12, and one seat at the table was now empty. 2 names emerged from the crowd. Joseph, called Barsabbas, and Matthias. The 11 prayed. Then they did something that sounds strange to modern ears. They cast lots. The pieces fell. The lot fell on Matthias, and just like that, a man whose name we had never heard before was numbered among the 12 apostles, equal to Peter, equal to John, equal to every man who would carry the gospel to the ends of the earth. Then the Bible falls silent, completely silent. Matthias is mentioned by name exactly twice in the entire New Testament, and never again after that one verse in the book of Acts. No epistles, no travels, no martyrdom recorded by Luke. Nothing. But here is the part nobody talks about. The silence in the New Testament is not the same as silence in early Christian history. Outside the canon, there are dozens of texts, fragments, traditions, and church father testimonies about Matthias. There are travel accounts, there are martyrdom narratives. There is even a gospel attributed to him, quoted by Clement of Alexandria, used by entire Christian communities for centuries before being declared forbidden and systematically erased. Why does the church remember him so carefully outside the Bible, when the Bible itself almost forgets him? What did he know that made his gospel dangerous enough to suppress? And what really happened in that prison on the Black Sea coast? To answer those questions, we have to start with something the church does not advertise. The Gospel of Matthias was a real document. It existed. It was read aloud in early Christian meetings. Clement of Alexandria, one of the greatest Christian scholars of the 2nd century, quoted from it directly. Origen, another giant of early Christian thought, knew of it and discussed it. Eusebius of Caesarea, the great church historian writing in the early 300s, listed it among the disputed books that some communities accepted as scripture and others rejected. By the 4th century, it had been quietly removed from circulation, not burned, not denounced as heresy, not the subject of dramatic councils, just slowly, carefully made to disappear. Copies stopped being made. The text faded out of the historical record. By the 5th century, it was effectively gone. What survived are fragments, scraps quoted by hostile witnesses or sympathetic ones, preserved by accident in the margins of other books. And the fragments that survived suggest something interesting. The Gospel of Matthias was not a narrative gospel like Mark or Luke. It did not retell the story of Jesus' life and death. It was a wisdom book, a collection of teachings, sayings attributed to Jesus and to Matthias himself. The teachings emphasized self-discipline, restraint, the subduing of the flesh, the inner spiritual life. That last detail matters more than it sounds, because in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Proto-Orthodox Church was fighting a war against a movement called Gnosticism. The Gnostics believed in secret knowledge, hidden teachings of Jesus passed down through chosen apostles, available only to spiritual initiates. Many Gnostic texts emphasized exactly the kind of inner discipline and contempt for the body that the Gospel of Matthias seemed to promote. So the Gospel of Matthias became collateral damage. It was associated, fairly or not, with a movement the Church was trying to crush. Its teaching sounded too close to the wrong neighborhood, and so it was set aside, then forgotten, then erased. But here is the question that should make you stop. If Matthias was so unimportant, so insignificant, so silent in the Bible, why was someone bothering to write a gospel in his name in the first place? You do not forge documents in the name of nobodies. You forge them in the name of figures whose authority is so respected that attaching their name lends credibility to your message. Whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthias understood something we have lost. They understood that Matthias was somebody whose teachings, real or imagined, carried weight, somebody who had things to say worth listening to. And the fact that the Church found his gospel dangerous enough to suppress tells us that whatever was in it, whatever community was preserving it, was a real threat to the version of Christianity that eventually won. So, who was the man whose gospel had to be erased? The earliest substantial information about Matthias comes from Eusebius of Caesarea, that same church historian. According to Eusebius, Matthias had been one of the 70 disciples sent out by Jesus during his earthly ministry. This was a larger group of followers mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, men Jesus sent ahead of him 2 by 2 into every town he was about to visit. This is a critical detail. It means that when the 11 needed to choose a replacement for Judas, they did not pick a random believer from the crowd. They picked a man who had already been commissioned by Jesus himself, sent out with authority to preach the kingdom and to heal the sick. Matthias was not an outsider. He was already an apostle in the broader sense of the word. The casting of lots simply confirmed what Jesus had set in motion years before. He had been there for everything. The Sermon on the Mount, the feeding of the 5,000, the raising of Lazarus, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the Last Supper, the arrest in Gethsemane, the cross, the empty tomb. He had walked beside Jesus for 3 years, watching, listening, learning. He just was not in the inner circle of three. He was not a Peter, James, or John, the disciples who got to witness the transfiguration on the mountain. He was on the outside looking in. But here is the thing about being on the outside looking in. You see things the inner circle misses. You hear conversations they were too important to attend. You watch the Master in his unguarded moments. And if you're paying attention, you might end up knowing more than the men whose names get written down. This is what some scholars believe was at the heart of the lost Gospel of Matthias, that it preserved a perspective the inner circle either missed or chose to ignore, a version of Jesus' teachings that emphasized the spiritual interior over the public miracles, a version that may have made Peter and the others uncomfortable because it suggested that the most profound things Jesus said were not the famous sermons, but the quiet conversations on the road, the moments around the campfire, the things he muttered to himself during long walks through Galilean wheat fields. If Matthias preserved that version, you can see why his gospel might have become a problem. It would have offered an alternative authority, a different way of being Christian, and in a young church desperately trying to standardize itself, alternative authorities were exactly what no one wanted. But the suppression of his gospel was only the second time the church tried to bury Matthias. The first time was even stranger. Here is something the priests will not preach about. Almost from the moment Matthias was chosen, there were Christians who insisted he should not have been. They claimed the 11 had acted prematurely, that they had jumped the gun, that the real 12th apostle had not yet been selected by God. They had a candidate in mind. His name was Saul of Tarsus, soon to be called Paul. A few chapters after Matthias is chosen, Paul is struck blind on the road to Damascus, hears the voice of Jesus calling him personally to be an apostle, and goes on to write almost half the New Testament. To his ancient supporters, Paul was the real 12th apostle, hand-picked by the risen Christ himself. Matthias was just a procedural placeholder, a mistake. A man chosen by impatient men using a method, casting lots, that the New Testament never uses again after Pentecost. This argument has been around for nearly 2,000 years. It sounds logical on the surface, and it is dead wrong. Paul himself buried it in a single line. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he writes that the risen Jesus appeared first to Cephas, that is Peter, and then to the 12, not 11, 12. By the time Paul is writing his letters, the 12 are already complete. Matthias is already counted among them. Paul does not dispute it. He calls himself an apostle of a different kind, one born out of due time, an apostle to the Gentiles. A different role entirely. And the casting of lots was no rookie mistake. It was the most sacred Jewish method for discerning the will of God. The high priests had used it for centuries to decide who would enter the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. The land of Israel itself had been divided among the 12 tribes by lot. The book of Proverbs says it plainly. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Matthias was chosen, not by Peter, not by the 11, by God himself. And yet the rumor that he was a mistake has been quietly circulating in some Christian communities for 2,000 years. It is one of the oldest hit jobs in church history. Why? Why has there been a campaign, sometimes loud and sometimes whispered, to erase Matthias from the list of legitimate apostles? The answer brings us back to that prison on the Black Sea coast. After Pentecost, after the Holy Spirit fell and the church exploded into existence, the 12 apostles divided up the known world. Each of them was assigned a region to evangelize. Peter went to Rome. Thomas, according to tradition, went to India. Andrew went to Greece and the Black Sea coast. James, the brother of John, went to Spain, and Matthias drew the worst lot of all. According to a text known as the Acts of Andrew and Matthias, preserved in Greek and Coptic manuscripts dating back to the 2nd century, Matthias was sent to a place called Myrmidonia, the city of the cannibals. A real place, somewhere along the Black Sea coast, in the wild lands north of the civilized world. The Greeks and Romans had heard of the people who lived there. The Scythians, the Colchians, tribes the Greeks lumped together as barbarians. They had reputations for violence, for strange burial practices, and yes, occasionally for ritual cannibalism. To a Mediterranean Greek or Jew, these were the edges of the world, the lands where civilization ended and chaos began. Picture the journey. From Jerusalem, Matthias would have traveled north through Syria, perhaps stopping in Antioch, where the disciples were first called Christians. From Antioch, the road went up through the mountains of eastern Anatolia, through lands that had once belonged to the Hittites and now belonged to whoever happened to be passing through with the most soldiers. Brigands worked the mountain passes. Local kings fought small, dirty wars over villages that no one in Rome had ever heard of. A lone preacher with no military escort, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a message about a crucified Jewish carpenter, was an easy target for anyone who wanted to make trouble. And that was the easy part of the journey. Once Matthias crossed the mountains and reached the southern shore of the Black Sea, he was leaving the world the Greeks and Romans had mapped. The Black Sea was the edge of civilization. The Greeks had a saying that the sea was inhospitable, an unfriendly water surrounded by unfriendly people. They told stories about its coast that sound a lot like the legends later attached to Matthias. Tribes that drank from human skulls. Tribes that buried their dead in mounds the size of small hills. Tribes that worshipped gods the Greeks could not name, and whose rites the Greeks were forbidden to witness. Some of these stories were exaggeration, some were probably propaganda from rival peoples, but some were not. Archaeological excavations along the Black Sea coast have uncovered Scythian burial mounds containing the remains of human sacrifices. They have found ritual objects that suggest practices the Mediterranean world considered abominable. The Greeks were not making it all up. Into this world walked Matthias, alone, unarmed. According to the ancient text, he reached Myrmidonia and began to preach. The people of the city captured him almost immediately. They had a system for dealing with strangers. They would gouge out the captive's eyes with a sharpened stake. They would force him to drink a potion brewed from grass and human flesh, a drug designed to destroy his mind and turn him into a docile animal. Then they would lock him in a stone prison, fatten him for 30 days, and slaughter him for a feast. Matthias became their captive. They blinded him on the first day. They forced the potion down his throat. But the ancient text says something extraordinary happened. Matthias prayed to Jesus, and the drug had no effect on him. His mind stayed clear. Then his eyes were healed in the darkness of the prison. He sat in the cell, sighted again but pretending to be blind, and waited. Around him, other prisoners, other captured travelers, sat in their drugged stupor, slowly being prepared for the slaughter. He had been there for nearly 30 days. The day of his execution was approaching, and then, according to the legend, the apostle Andrew arrived. Andrew, who had been preaching elsewhere on the Black Sea coast, was given a vision by Jesus telling him to go and rescue Matthias. He arrived at Myrmidonia by miraculous means, walking across the water or carried by an angel, depending on which version you read. He found Matthias in the prison. The two apostles confronted the cannibals together. Through a combination of preaching, miracles, and divine intervention, the city was transformed. The cannibals were converted. The captives were freed. The dark practices ended. And here is where the story gets even stranger, because if you stop reading the legend literally and start reading it as a heavily mythologized account of something that actually happened, the picture that emerges is haunting. The early church preserved this story for a reason. They did not just make it up. They believed something real had happened on the Black Sea coast, something so dangerous and so foreign that to the Mediterranean mind, it might as well have been the land of monsters. Matthias had walked into a place no one else would go. He had endured what no one else would endure. He had emerged with a community, however small, that traced its conversion back to him. And then, instead of going home, instead of returning to Jerusalem to write epistles and build a reputation, he kept going. After Myrmidonia, the traditions diverge. Some say Matthias preached in Ethiopia. Others say he went to Cappadocia in modern Turkey. Still others place him in the region of Colchis, in what is now the country of Georgia. The Georgian Orthodox Church to this day claims Matthias as one of the founders of their ancient Christian tradition, and they point to a small village near the Black Sea coast as the site of his tomb. How did he die? Even on this question, the sources cannot agree. The most widespread tradition says he was stoned to death by a hostile pagan crowd, and then beheaded with an axe to make sure the work was finished. This is why Matthias is almost always depicted in Christian art, holding a battle axe or a halberd, the weapon of his execution. A different tradition says he was crucified, like so many of the other apostles. Another says he died peacefully of old age in his bed, having outlived almost every other member of the original 12. The disagreement is not really a problem. It is what you would expect from a figure whose history was preserved orally for generations before anyone wrote it down. Different communities remembered him differently because different communities had encountered him at different stages of his life. What is consistent across all the traditions is the picture of the man himself. Matthias is never portrayed as flashy or charismatic. He is not a Peter thundering at crowds. He is not a Paul dictating epistles that would shape Western civilization. He is something quieter and harder. He is the man who shows up when nobody else will. He is the man who walks into the dark places. He is the man who finishes the work without expecting his name to be remembered. There is a strange honor in that. If you are still here, watching, if this story is gripping you the way it gripped me when I first started researching it, take a second to subscribe to the channel, because what I am about to tell you next is the part that the medieval church spent centuries arguing about, the part that makes the disappearance of Matthias even more suspicious, and the part that connects directly to a German cathedral where his bones, or what tradition holds to be his bones, still rest today. Now, back to the story. In the year 326, an old woman in her late 70s set out on one of the most extraordinary journeys in late antiquity. Her name was Helena. She was the mother of Constantine, the Roman emperor who had just declared Christianity legal across the empire. Helena was a fierce, intelligent woman with one driving obsession in the final years of her life. She was determined to find and recover the relics of the apostles, the bones, the artifacts, the physical traces of the men who had walked with Jesus. She wanted to bring them back to the Christian world and place them under the protection of the empire her son now ruled. Helena traveled to Jerusalem. She traveled to Bethlehem. She is credited with finding the true cross, the actual wood of the cross of Christ, beneath a temple of Venus that the Romans had built over the site of Calvary. And then, according to one tradition, she traveled to a small mountain village somewhere in the lands of the Black Sea, and she retrieved the bones of Matthias. She brought them back across the empire to Trier, in what is now Western Germany. Trier was at the time one of the imperial capitals, a city that rivaled Rome itself. There she had the bones of Matthias placed in a church that would later become the Abbey of St. Matthias. The site is still there today. Pilgrims still visit. The bones, or what tradition holds to be the bones, are still venerated. This is the only tomb of an apostle north of the Alps. The only one. Every other apostle is buried, or believed to be buried, in the Mediterranean world or further east. Peter in Rome, Andrew in Patras, Thomas in southern India, James in Spain. But Matthias, alone of the 12, ended up in Germany. And here is what nobody asks. Why? Why him? Why was he the one apostle whose bones were carried so far from the lands he had walked? Why did Helena, who could have brought back any apostle's relics, choose to bring back his? The answer some scholars have suggested is uncomfortable. They believe that by the 4th century, Matthias was the apostle whose memory was most actively endangered. The community that had preserved his teachings, the people who had passed down his gospel, were being absorbed into other traditions or fading out entirely. His relics, his physical bones, were the last anchor to a man whose written record was being erased. By bringing them to the safest place in the empire, by placing them under the protection of the imperial capital, Helena was preserving what could no longer be preserved any other way. Whether or not that is true, the result is the same. Trier became the only major pilgrimage site for Matthias in the Western world. Throughout the Middle Ages, peasants and nobles walked hundreds of miles to pray at his tomb. They came because they believed that the apostle who had been forgotten by the scriptures had not been forgotten by God. And maybe that is the deeper meaning of the entire story. Christianity has always celebrated its loud heroes, the Peters, the Pauls, the Augustines, the men whose words filled libraries and whose disputes shaped the course of civilization. But there has always been a second tradition running beneath the loud one, a tradition of hidden faithfulness, work done without applause, saints who never made the headlines. Matthias belongs to that tradition. He is the patron, in a sense, of every believer who serves without recognition, the parent who teaches faith without ever standing in a pulpit, the missionary who labors for decades in a country whose language they will never quite master, the Christian who shows up on a Tuesday morning, year after year, without ever expecting their name to be spoken. The contrast with Judas could not be more pointed. Judas had every advantage, handpicked by Jesus for the inner circle, holding the money bag, sitting at the Last Supper, dipping bread in the same dish as his teacher. He had access, status, intimacy with the Son of God himself, and he traded it all for 30 pieces of silver and a kiss in a garden. Matthias had none of those advantages. He was on the outside looking in for 3 years, watching from the edge of the crowd, never invited into the moments that would later be written down. And yet when the choice came, he was found faithful. And Judas, with all his privilege, was found wanting. The first becomes last. The last becomes first. The famous betrayer is replaced by the unknown disciple. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. According to one of the oldest accounts of his death, when Matthias was finally killed for his faith, his last words were a prayer not for himself, but for his executioners. He asked God to forgive them. He asked God to let his death plant a seed in the soil of their hearts. And then he was gone. Where Judas died in despair, hanging himself from a tree, Matthias died in faith, with a prayer of forgiveness on his lips. The traitor and the replacement could not have been more different. And the difference was never in their giftedness or their fame. It was in the quiet quality of their faithfulness over time. The early church did not erase Matthias because he was unimportant. They erased him because he was inconvenient. He represented a path the institution could not control. A Christianity too quiet, too internal, too dangerous in its implication that the most profound parts of Jesus' teaching were not the public miracles, but the private ones. So they let his name appear once in Acts chapter 1 verse 26. He was numbered with the 11 apostles, and then they let him fade. But the people remembered. The Georgian Christians and the Coptic Christians, the German pilgrims at Trier, the lost gospel writers, the icon painters. They kept his memory alive in the small places, in the back rooms where official history could not reach. And now, 2,000 years later, you remember too. Matthias is the patron saint of everyone who has ever felt invisible, the 13th apostle who was always meant to be the 12th, the man God called when no one else was looking. If his story tells us anything, it is this: God notices, God remembers, God chooses, even the quiet ones, maybe especially you. But there is one more thing, and this is the part that almost nobody talks about, even in the world of biblical scholarship, because it complicates everything I have just told you. In December of 1945, in a remote part of Upper Egypt, near a town called Nag Hammadi, a peasant farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer at the base of a cliff. His shovel struck something hard. He uncovered a sealed clay jar, almost a meter tall. Inside the jar were 13 leather-bound codices, written in Coptic, dating to the 4th century. They were the lost library of an ancient Christian community that had buried their texts to hide them from the Orthodox authorities. The codices contained Gospels and Apocalypses that nobody had read in over 1,500 years. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary, and among them, a fragmentary text that some scholars believe contains material from the lost Gospel of Matthias. The text is called the Book of Thomas the Contender. It opens with a strange claim. It says the words it contains were spoken in secret by Jesus to his brother Judas Thomas, and that they were written down by a man named Matthias, the same Matthias, the 13th apostle, the one whose gospel was supposed to have been completely erased. Most scholars are cautious about this attribution. The text is too short, too fragmentary, the historical chain too unclear, but there is a serious minority of researchers who believe that what we have in the Book of Thomas the Contender is a partial preservation of the Gospel of Matthias, a document the Church spent 15 centuries trying to bury, accidentally surviving in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert because the people who hid it loved it more than they feared the authorities who wanted it destroyed. If they are right, we now have, for the first time in modern history, fragments of what Matthias actually taught, and the teachings are exactly what the early church was afraid of. They emphasize the inner life, the spiritual struggle, the body as a prison, the soul's journey toward truth. They sound nothing like the public preaching of Peter or the structured theology of Paul. They sound like something whispered by a man who had walked alone into the city of cannibals and come back changed. There is one more thing too. The Georgian Orthodox Church preserves a tradition that the bones at Trier are not the real bones of Matthias. According to this tradition, the bones brought back by Helena were placed in Trier as a public relic, while the actual remains of Matthias were hidden in a cave somewhere in the Caucasus Mountains, in a location known only to a handful of monks who passed the secret down by word of mouth. The cave has never been officially located. The monks who guarded the secret died out during the Soviet persecution of the 20th century. The location, if it ever existed, may now be lost forever, which means that the apostle who was buried twice by history might still be hidden somewhere in a mountain cave on the edge of the world, waiting to be found. The 13th apostle, the man whose gospel was suppressed, the man whose tomb may not be where we think it is, the man whose silence in the scriptures has been the loudest silence in Christian history. Maybe his story is not over yet. Maybe it is just beginning. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about the hidden saints in your own life, take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell us about a quiet, faithful person who shaped your story, someone whose name the world will never know, but whose work changed everything for you. And if you want more stories like this, stories of the lesser-known figures of the Bible, the ones whose names have been buried by history, but whose lives still echo in the dark corners of the church, subscribe to the channel. There is one more video I want you to watch next. The story of another apostle the church almost forgot. A man whose missionary journey took him further east than any of the others, whose tomb is hidden in a place you would never expect, and whose gospel was also suppressed. His name might surprise you. The video is in the description below. Click it now while it is still on your mind. Until next time, keep listening for the quiet voices. Sometimes they are the ones telling the truth.